Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take some really compelling sources, stuff our listeners send in, and just, pull out the key things you need to know.
Yeah, sort of like a shortcut to getting seriously well-informed without having to wade through everything yourself.
Exactly. And today, wow, we're diving into quite the epic.
We really are. A listener sent us excerpts from A Brief History of Russia by Associate Professor Dr. Afisavad Chayapolfit Sirivathana Waravachara.
That's quite a name.
It is, and the scope is huge. We're talking ancient tribes all the way up to, well, basically modern Russia.
Covering everything: politics, society, economics, culture. It's all in there.
Absolutely. It tracks all those shifts and turns that shaped this, immense and influential nation.
And the big question for me right off the bat was how? How does this collection of, scattered tribes across this enormous landscape, how does that become the Russia we think of today, this vast, powerful entity?
It's the core question, isn't it? Let's start right back at the beginning. Geographically, ancient Russia was just vast.
Right.
Super diverse terrains, from the Arctic tundra down to the southern steppes.
And not one unified people, you're saying?
No, definitely not. It was more like a patchwork, different areas, different tribes. So right from the get-go, we're not looking at some single cohesive group.
Okay, so a real mix. The source mentions some specific early groups, doesn't it? These sclaves down south.
Yeah, exactly. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, Ptolemy mentions the southern Russians, calls them slaves. They were living in territory that's roughly modern-day Poland.
Oh, Poland. Okay.
And apparently they were quite numerous and known for being pretty warlike.
Warlike. Okay, that sets a certain tone early on.
It definitely hints at the kind of power dynamics and conflicts that would unfold later,
And there were others further north, too, with some interesting names.
There were. You had the Vizi. They were also called the pin trees.
Yeah.
Apparently because of all the fir trees there.
Ah, makes sense.
Yeah, and the name actually survives in the town of Pinsk. And then down in the Zhytomyr region, you had the Polyane. What's really fascinating is we get a glimpse of their early beliefs.
Like what?
Well, they worshipped rivers, had a deep reverence for them, and Perun, the god of the storm.
So very connected to the natural world.
Very much so. These early spiritual ties, they would have been really important in shaping their identity, how they saw the world.
Paints a picture, definitely. And the source hints at some early, maybe missed chances for unity. Something about St. Rurik.
Yeah, this is intriguing. It mentions the Livonians living near the Dvina River. And apparently the king of Hungary made an offer to St. Rurik, a Russian prince.
An offer.
Yeah, the deal was if Rurik recognized the Hungarian king's son-in-law as the king of the Russians, then Rurik would get Livonian territory.
Wow. So a potential early unification deal.
Exactly. It's one of those historical what-ifs. Could Russia have unified much earlier and very differently if that had happened?
A real sliding doors moment, huh? And it wasn't just about tribes and politics. Kievan Rus', when it emerged, was actually doing okay financially.
Yeah, the evidence, the ethnographical stuff, it points to Kievan Rus' being on pretty solid financial ground back in the 10th and 11th centuries.
Which must have been key for its growth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That economic stability was essential for it becoming such a major regional power at the time.
But then things changed dramatically.
Yeah.
The Mongol invasion. That sounds like a huge disruption.
Oh, completely. 1240. That year is just this brutal turning point. The Mongols invade, they establish the Golden Horde, the western chunk of their empire.
And that's the end of Kievan Rus'.
Pretty much. It brings that whole era to a really decisive, violent end, just reshapes the entire political map.
And out of that chaos, something unexpected happens. Moscow starts to rise.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. Moscow was just this minor town, really on the edge of what was left of Kievan Rus', and somehow it climbs up to become the dominant principality. Well, the source points to a couple of things. One, just sheer resilience, but maybe even more important was the shrewd diplomacy of Moscow's rulers. They were really clever, really adaptable, always finding ways to grab more land.
So while others were reeling from the invasion, Moscow was playing a longer game.
You could say that. The Golden Horde, their main interest in the Rus' principalities was installing rulers who'd pay up. Tribute, basically.
Right.
But Grand Prince Alexander Nevsky, he was smart. He negotiated a certain amount of autonomy for the Rus' princes in exchange for that tribute.
Ah, okay. So that created a system Moscow could work within.
Exactly. As Moscow got stronger, it could sort of leverage its relationship with the Horde to its own advantage. Very strategic.
Okay, so the late 13th century is when Moscow's rise really kicks off. Prince Daniel inherits a fairly small patch of land, right?
No.
Not exactly a powerhouse start.
No, not initially. And remember, the capital of the Russes had actually moved before. It went from Novgorod down to Kiev after the Vikings showed up.
Ah, right. Kiev was important because of the trade route.
Yeah, prime location on the Dnieper River, the route down to Constantinople. Big political and cultural center back then.
Still a major player. But then, like you said, the Mongol yoke, this period of Mongol rule, it creates a power vacuum.
It does. And Moscow, through this, combination of resilience and really cunning leadership over generations.
Yeah, just step into the gap.
They're perfectly positioned. It's strategic opportunism, maybe, but also just persistent, clever politics over a long time.
Okay, fast forward a few centuries, another really rough patch. The time of troubles. Sounds pretty bad.
It was awful. Beginning of the 17th century, it kicks off after Tsar Boris Godunov dies, leaving the throne vacant. Big power vacuum again.
And wasn't there a famine around then, too?
Yes. A terrible famine in 1601. So you got political instability and mass suffering. Just leads to total chaos, widespread unrest, social breakdown.
What kind of chaos are we talking?
Well, the source mentions a lot. There was a huge Cossack uprising. They actually took the Kremlin in Moscow. Yeah, and apparently tortured and killed a lot of the boyars, the old aristocracy. And similar violence erupted in other big cities, like Tsaritsyn and Smolensk.
Brutal. And it wasn't just internal fighting. Foreign powers got involved.
Oh, yeah. Poland and Sweden saw their chance and launched interventions, made everything even worse, more complicated.
So internal chaos and foreign invasion.
Exactly. And interestingly, even the Golden Horde, which used to be so dominant, was having its own internal problems around this time. Didn't help stability anywhere.
Sounds like a crisis everywhere. What was the human cost of all this? The time of troubles.
Immense. The source says something like a third of the population died.
A third? That's staggering.
It really is. There were even linguistic shifts in what they called Little Russia parts of modern Ukraine. And all this chaos made the boyar families, the elites, desperate.
How so?
They started looking outside, thinking maybe a foreign prince could come in and restore order.
Bringing in a foreigner to rule, that sounds risky.
Well, it led to some pretty desperate moves. They actually invited Sophia of the House of Habsburg to take the throne at one point.
Did that work?
Nope. Promises were made, weren't kept. So eventually, the boyars petitioned for Mikhail Romanov. Problem was, he was still a kid, a minor.
A kid takes the throne after all that. Unbelievable. And this whole period, it left scars, right? Lingering legends.
Definitely. The source mentions long-lasting popular legends, folklore that grew out of this incredibly traumatic time. It really shaped Russian memory, Russian identity.
And out of that trauma, the Romanov dynasty emerges. And they stick around for a long time.
It's 300 years. And during that time, Russia goes from being this somewhat isolated kingdom to a massive global empire.
Right.
By 1700, they're firmly established. Mikhail, the first Romanov Tsar after the time of troubles, he marks the start of this new era of centralized power.
3 centuries. That means a lot of expansion. Those maps of Russia just keep getting bigger.
Oh, the expansion under the Romanovs was incredible, transformative. They pushed outwards from the Baltic, all the way to the Pacific. Wow.
And south, too, into areas that are now parts of Poland, Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan. Just a staggering amount of territory and influence gained.
But with all that expansion and power, did they lose touch with the ordinary people? Did the dynasty become kind of remote?
The source does suggest that. Over time, a growing distance developed between the Romanov dynasty and the everyday lives, the concerns of the Russian people. And that remoteness, that disconnect, it definitely became a factor later on, contributing to their downfall. And like a lot of European royals, they relied heavily on dynastic marriages.
Alliances and prestige.
Exactly. Which brings us to Nicholas II, the last Tsar, and his marriage to Alexandra, a German princess.
Right, and that marriage had tragic consequences, didn't it?
It did. Alexandra was German, but also Queen Victoria's granddaughter. The big problem was their son, Alexis. He inherited hemophilia B.
The royal disease.
Yeah, a result of all that interbreeding among European royal families. It was a huge national concern, not just a family tragedy, because they needed a healthy male heir for stability. And that desperation led them to Rasputin.
Exactly. They were desperate for a cure or even just relief for Alexis. And Grigory Rasputin, this peasant mystic, he somehow seemed able to help the boy.
Which gave him incredible influence over the Tsarina.
Alexandra became completely devoted to him, utterly convinced he was saving her son.
And that fueled all sorts of rumors.
Oh, definitely. Rumors flew everywhere that Rasputin was controlling Alexandra, and through her, controlling the Tsar himself. Whispers about dark forces in the palace. It just added massively to the political instability, eroded public trust.
Okay, so the Romanovs are consolidating power, expanding, but these cracks are definitely appearing. Then we get Peter the Great trying to forcibly modernize Russia.
Peter, yeah. He's seen as this really pivotal figure, the one who really starts transforming the Tsardom of Muscovy into the Russian Empire.
And he looked west for inspiration.
Absolutely. He saw Western Europe as the model. He wanted Russia to catch up, emulate their advancements. He set clear, modern territorial goals for Russia, really boosted its international standing.
And his methods were pretty drastic, weren't they? Top-down reforms.
Oh, yeah. Nothing subtle about Peter. Sweeping changes. Admin, army, domestic policy, social stuff, economic stuff. He touched almost everything.
He definitely earned the great part of his name then.
He did. His westernization policy, it was a deliberate, forceful push to bring in European ideas, tech, culture. He felt Russia was way behind, lacked coherence.
So not just about adopting fashion, but about survival, competing on the world stage.
Precisely. For Peter, achieving Russian greatness wasn't just about armies and borders. It needed fundamental social intellectual change, too. He wanted to reshape the Russian elite, make them more like their Western counterparts.
And he focused this effort initially on one place, right? St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg, exactly.
Yeah.
His window on the West. He built it deliberately as this European-style capital for the court, the nobles, to attract foreign experts.
Showcase.
Totally. And over time, the influence spread outwards. But the city itself just transformed rapidly, became crowded, dynamic, new manners, new identities, new customs, all European-inspired.
Must have been a real culture clash, though.
Oh, for sure. You've got these new white fortresses, Western-style palaces, modern ships, right alongside deeply ingrained local traditions, attitudes, myths.
And Peter wasn't too concerned about those local views.
The source suggests not much. Limited understanding, even less tolerance for those local perspectives from the people pushing the westernization agenda. The reforms were often just imposed, like it or not.
Okay, jump forward again. Another powerful ruler, Catherine the Great, also big on expansion.
Catherine II, yeah, another formidable ruler, and definitely focused on expansion. She grabbed huge territories through wars and diplomacy.
From who?
Sweden, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, Poland, Lithuania, various groups in the south. Her conquests really forced the rest of Europe to take Russia much more seriously as a major power.
And her involvement in partitioning Poland had huge long-term effects.
Absolutely. Those partitions, carving up Poland between Russia, Austria, and Prussia, it crushed the Polish state, but ignited this incredibly strong Polish nationalism that lasted for centuries, fueled uprisings, shaped the whole region.
And this is happening around the time of the French Revolution, too, right? Ideas spreading.
Yeah, revolutionary ideas from Paris were definitely in the air. Catherine, like other enlightened monarchs, got increasingly worried about maintaining order in her own empire.
So expansion abroad, but keeping a lid on things at home. She was quite a figure herself, wasn't she?
Oh, incredibly intelligent, ambitious. Her published letters, her correspondence, they were actually a big deal in the intellectual discussions of the time about good governance, even about women ruling.
She rose fast, but the dynasty fell dramatically later.
Yeah, the source notes that contrast. Her rapid rise, then the dynasty's fall just a century later, shows how volatile power could be. Initially, though, her brains and ambition, they really convinced people, nobles and commoners, that she was suited for autocratic rule. She talked a big game about enlightened reform, a new moral code.
But that image didn't quite hold up.
Over time, yeah, her self-image as this enlightened ruler got kind of inflated, disconnected from reality for many nobles and peasants.
She lost favor.
And her own son took power in a coup.
After her death, yes. Polhino seized power, shows the instability, the potential for violence, even at the very top of that autocratic system.
From Catherine to Napoleon's invasion, that disastrous winter campaign must have been another huge turning point.
Absolutely pivotal. Napoleon's massive army aiming for Great Moscow just got crushed by the Russian winter.
And Kutuzov's strategy.
Yes, the source credits General Kutuzov's leadership, but also just the sheer determination, the resistance of the Russian people. They were furious. Apparently, officers sometimes had trouble stopping their own soldiers from taking revenge on French prisoners.
Wow. Winter and resilience, a powerful combo. And the aftermath really reshaped Europe again.
Totally. By 1813, Napoleon's army was in full retreat, just devastated losses. The Congresses in Prague and Vienna redrew the map, tried to restore a balance of power. And Russia ended up friendly with the new French monarchy.
Yeah, kind of ironic. Friendly relations with the new constitutional monarchy in France after Napoleon.
How did the Russian elite feel about that after fighting Napoleon?
Well, it caused some disillusionment, especially among educated Russians who'd been exposed to some of the liberal ideas floating around Europe during the wars.
Right.
The source makes an interesting comparison, actually, between the Russian tactics retreat, scorched earth, and the Roman general Fabius fighting Hannibal.
Delaying tactics.
Exactly. And it's funny, Tsar Alexander's court had actually been quite pro-French before Napoleon. French language, French culture were big.
Influences come and go. And the return of the old French nobility after Napoleon had ripples in Russia, too.
Yeah, some of those returning French nobles were linked to secret societies, Masonic lodges, ideas associated with more liberal politics. Even though they were old regime in France, those republican ideals from the revolution had struck a chord with some Slavs, including in Russia.
So some lasting changes from that era, even with the monarchy restored.
Some things stuck. More religious tolerance in places, new legal codes, even some experiments with communal organization here and there.
Okay, so the early 19th century, after Napoleon, the source calls it relatively calm in Russia, a spiritual awakening under Nicholas III.
That's the description, yeah. But underneath that calm surface, there was definitely stuff brewing. Reformist movements, even revolutionary ideas among military officers, intellectuals, not just in Russia, but all over Europe. Paris, London, Hungary, Italy.
So rumblings below the surface.
Definitely. The source says these movements in Russia had unexpected but kind of contained consequences back then, not a serious threat to the government yet.
Why not?
Well, the government kept a very close eye on things, strict supervision. And the movements themselves were maybe a bit abstract initially, didn't have mass support, so relative peace, but maybe attention shifted to old grievances up north. The provinces weren't really involved in these early political stirrings in the cities.
Right. A calm before the storm, perhaps. Which brings us to the next big wave. Industrialization in the second half of the 19th century. How did that change things?
The economy was recovering, growing. New taxes came in around 1883, but the whole structure was shifting gradually. Agriculture was still dominated by the old landed gentry, the cadets. But the industrial sector, that was growing, increasingly influenced by like British and American business methods, but maybe changing slower structurally at first.
So uneven change. And lots of hopes for progress, freedom, opportunity, but maybe not realized for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Big expectations, but the source suggests a lot of them went unfulfilled for most people. Attempts at reform through things like the state council often got bogged down. Ministry of Finance changes, conflicting priorities, you know how it goes.
Bureaucracy and infighting.
Pretty much. Even a dedicated Ministry of State Income couldn't really sort out the mess of old taxes.
But despite all that, Russia did become a major industrial player.
Oh, yeah. Despite the hurdles, they made huge strides. Late 19th century, Russia's pumping out a lot of steel, iron, machinery, textiles. Top 6 globally, even beating Britain in some areas.
Which leads us right into the early 20th century, and the conditions are ripe for revolution. 1917, industrial growth, but deep social problems still simmering.
Absolutely. By then, Russia had significant industrial and farm output. The source even gives stats on national income, number of workers.
But the land issue is still huge, right? Inequality.
Massive. Russian peasants had tiny plots compared to, say, American farmers. And while a lot of grain went to market, that trade was controlled by a few powerful Moscow merchants. So yeah, Russia was modernizing, industrializing, but it also created new problems. Capitalist-style privatization, the source calls it, hitting the working class hard. Bad conditions, low wages.
So the benefits weren't shared, fueling discontent.
Exactly. Revolutionary ideas gained traction. People wanted radical solutions. Some in power wanted crackdowns, secret police, even pogroms, horrifyingly.
But others looked elsewhere.
Yeah, social democrats, influenced by Plekhanov, turned to Marxism. They saw a revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the answer. Though Plekhanov himself also talked about building civil society first, freedom of press, assembly recognizing Russia was different.
Okay, let's get into 1917 itself. 2 revolutions. First, February. It starts with textile workers striking in Petrograd.
It does, yeah. February 23rd, 1917, which is actually March 8th on our calendar. They were fed up. Bad conditions, wartime shortages of food, fuel. Worker irritation was sky high, especially since war industries were making bank while they suffered.
And it spread fast.
Yeah.
Beyond just those workers.
Like wildfire. Quickly became a general political strike. People from all walks of life joined in. Everyone was feeling the pain of the war, the Tsar's incompetence, and crucially...
The soldiers.
Yeah. Revolutionary soldiers started joining the strikers, even calling for revolt. That was the tipping point.
The army turning. That's always critical, and the government just fumbled it.
Completely underestimated it. By Feb 25th, March 10th, some ministers knew it was dangerous, but the government's response was stubborn, inadequate, just made things worse. By the 26th, the Duma, the elected body, felt they had to step in.
So two power centers emerging. The Tsar's crumbling government and the Duma trying to take control.
Kind of. It was chaos. The Tsar's police tried suppression, arrests. The Duma tried recruiting its own militias. The government declared martial law, censorship, postponed the Constituent Assembly, all things that just angered people more. But within the Duma, this idea quickly gained traction. Address the people, promise a just democratic order, a clear break from the old regime.
It's not like the monarchy was just totally out of its depth, no real plan.
This source really emphasizes that. Their big mistake was having no actual plan to stop the rebellion in St. Petersburg, besides just shooting people, which, doesn't tend to win hearts and minds.
Okay.
So the February Revolution, it was absolute, irreversible. The empire collapsed. Nicholas II abdicated. No way to transfer power peacefully by then.
A massive shift. And out of that comes the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. But that setup was shaky, leading to October.
Yeah, by autumn 1917, Russia was just in turmoil. The provisional government, liberals, moderate socialists couldn't handle it. War dragging on, economy collapsing, radical movements rising, and the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin.
Peace, land, and bread.
Exactly. A powerful slogan. Gaining huge support, especially workers, soldiers. Soviet history books always stress the role of peasants, workers, soldiers, Marxist ideas, and what happened next.
And the October Revolution itself, in Petrograd anyway, was pretty quick. Relatively bloodless.
In the capital, yes. October or November by our calendar. Bolshevik allied armed groups seized key spots, government buildings, communications, transport. Overthrew the weak provisional government pretty quickly. Not much fighting in Petrograd itself.
No.
Lenin and the Bolsheviks then set up their new Soviet regime. Ideologically rigid, but tactically flexible in grabbing control.
While it was quick in the capital, it unleashed hell across the rest of the country, right?
Oh, absolutely. The October Revolution, while maybe less bloody initially in Petrograd, had massive, devastating consequences. First communist regime aiming for total social restructuring. That inevitably meant repression as they dismantled the old order, tried to force a new class consciousness.
And it happened way faster than Marxist theory predicted.
Yeah, theory said gradual evolution after a bourgeois revolution. Russia just jumped from autocracy straight to attempting a proletarian dictatorship. And because they saw threats everywhere, foreign capitalists, internal enemies, the bourgeoisie, they increasingly used force, coercion, to stay in power. Crisis mode became permanent.
Which leads straight into the Civil War. So much for peace.
Right. They negotiated peace with Germany to get out of WWI, but then, boom, civil war erupts in 1918. Bloody, brutal. The anti-communist whites, backed by foreign powers against the Bolshevik Reds, fought all across the old empire.
And the Reds won in the end.
Eventually, yeah, by 1920-21, which solidified their control.
And then they formally created the USSR in 1922. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Transcaucasia, trying to lock down the new order, though tensions remained under the surface.
Definitely. Formal union, but deep national identities, cultural differences, political aspirations, they didn't just vanish. And all this political change happened alongside total economic collapse. Production plummeted, food shortages, devastating famine. Millions died.
Horrific. And even the workers, the supposed heroes of the revolution, faced suppression if they protested.
Yeah, strikes against government policies were put down forcefully by the Red Army, the security forces. Facing all this opposition, internal instability, fear of the West, the leadership shifted. More focus on nationalism, patriotism, total state control of industry. Pragmatic shifts like the NEP, new economic policy were temporary.
And then Stalin rises. The focus shifts again to forced, rapid industrialization, with terrible costs.
Under Stalin, yeah. Rapid industrialization became the national policy, but it meant forced collectivization of agriculture, destroyed traditional farming, caused chaos, mass famine, millions dead.
And the Great Terror.
1937-38, just brutal mass repression, targeting everyone, intellectuals, old opponents, military leaders, ordinary people, anyone seem as an enemy. Then, June 22, 1941.
Nazi invasion.
Changes everything, transforms the war from an international ideological thing into this deeply personal national fight for survival, revenge.
So the revolution's ideals just dissolve into totalitarianism, repression, immense suffering. Let's look closer at the Civil War and the USSR's formation. The initial Bolshevik message sounded almost democratic.
Right after October 17, they talked about a government based on Soviets, worker, soldier, peasant councils, unions, revolutionary groups. Sounded decentralized, consultative.
They didn't last.
Nope. Quickly became centralized, authoritarian Bolshevik party rule. Interestingly, though, even key Bolshevik leaders were initially skeptical about the October Revolution happening when it did.
That internal uncertainty must have added to the chaos across the country. And there was this huge disconnect between leaders in the cities and people out in the countryside.
Massive disconnect. People in the provinces often had no clue what was really happening in Petrograd or Moscow, what the October coup even meant. The civil war that followed, 1917-22, just ravaged the country, especially the core agricultural areas, knocked Russia backwards economically, made it more like an underdeveloped empire in some way.
And culturally destructive, too, destroying historical stuff.
Yeah, the Bolsheviks went after symbols of the Tsarist past, the thousand-year history they saw as oppression. Museums, monuments destroyed, industrialization sputtered, forced labor. Then the famine's late 20s and the horrific documentary Holocaust in Ukraine and the Volga in 37-38, millions dead, plus forced deportations, displacing people on the peripheries, just immense disruption and suffering, unlike anything seen elsewhere on that scale.
Then Stalin's rule proper, officially portrayed as progress, but the reality was fear and repression.
Exactly. The official story was economic construction, collectivization as achievements. The reality for millions was repression, exile to labor camps, starvation, the purges, the Great Terror. It showed anyone could be branded an enemy. Mass arrests, gulags, executions.
And the party's narrative about fighting fascism conveniently ignored the millions killed by their own policies, including Poles, other minorities, and they used the threat of war to justify the pact with Nazi Germany.
Absolutely. Post-WWII, they pushed the narrative of Stalinism as heroic struggle. No nation is free without a strong state. Then another wave of repression hit elites in places like Poland, branded bourgeois nationalists. After Stalin died in 1953, it didn't stop more terror campaigns, austerity, anti-capitalist rhetoric. Blaming individual officials for economic problems was just window dressing, trying to patch up Marxist theory without changing the broken system.
Turning to WWII itself, the Soviets knew about Hitler's plans pretty early, July 1939. Replacing Litvinov with Molotov was a big signal.
Yeah, Soviet intelligence, Stalin himself, they knew Germany was gearing up by July 1939. Getting rid of Litvinov, who favored aligning with the West against Hitler, and putting in the hardliner Molotov that clearly signaled a major policy shift dictated by Stalin.
And that shift led to the decision in August 1939 to make a deal with Germany, because Hitler was going for Poland.
Faced with Hitler's definite plan to invade Poland, right on their border, and no solid guarantees from the West, Stalin made that, well, pragmatic, though deeply cynical decision on August 13th. Cut a deal with Hitler. Buy time, expand Soviet influence, avoid immediate war.
And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact happened incredibly fast.
Amazingly fast. Total secrecy. Signed August 23, 1939 in Moscow. Announced August 24th, shocked the world. And the secret part, dividing Poland and Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, that was finalized September 28th after the invasion started.
So Hitler and Stalin basically carved up Poland over the phone.
Pretty much. Direct communication, bypassing formal channels, shows how personalized, autocratic both regimes were.
And then both sides moved troops in fast, keeping everything hush-hush.
Rapid military buildup along the new dividing lines in Poland. Strict secrecy within the leadership about operational plans. Very small circles knew the details.
So Germany takes Western Poland. The Soviet sphere becomes Western Ukraine, Belarus, parts of Masovia and Galicia. And Soviet troops move in to crush any Polish government there.
Exactly. As Germany annexed the West, the Soviets moved into their designated zone, Western Ukraine, Belarus, plus those other areas. Orders were explicit: dismantle any Polish government structures, suppress any resistance.
And at the same time, massive counterintelligence, shutting down transport, communication.
Full lockdown in their occupied zone, suspend transport, cut phone lines, break up any gatherings, deploy troops and NKVD everywhere to secure borders and key points by September 11th. Total control.
The wartime alliance against Hitler eventually crumbles, leading into the Cold War. This huge ideological struggle.
Yeah, the Cold War.
Sustained geopolitical fight after WWII. Ideology, military competition, proxy wars. U.S.-led democratic capitalism versus Soviet state-run communism. Deeply opposed systems.
Intense propaganda, nuclear threat, proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, but no direct superpower war because of mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. Mandy kept a lid on direct conflict. Lots of rhetoric, spying, arms races, security treaties like NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Proxy conflicts were where the fighting happened.
And ultimately, the Soviets couldn't sustain it. Eastern Bloc collapses in '89, USSR itself in '91.
Yeah, it was a failure for them. Economic strain, inefficiency, popular discontent, it all came crashing down. Tension started right after WWII ended, really. Yalta, Potsdam carving up Germany, setting spheres of influence by '48.
And the gap just widened. Soviet control in Eastern Europe was often brutal, breeding resentment.
Definitely. Repression fueled anger among all sorts of groups.
Yeah.
Made Soviet control unstable in the long run.
Then 1989 happens. Hungary, East Germany, the invasion of the Soviet Empire, the collapse fueled by paranoia and anger. Yeah, the changes in Hungary, people leaving East Germany that lit the fuse. Regimes fell across Eastern Europe, driven by popular anger, but also fear within the old guard losing control. A potent mix.
And that inspired independence movements inside the USSR, like the Baltics declaring independence in '90.
Big time. The Eastern European revolts emboldened nationalist movements in the Soviet republics. The Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia led the way, declared independence in August '90. The Red Army resisted but couldn't stop it.
But the Soviet hardliners tried to cling on. The August '91 coup.
Yeah, continued denial repression culminated in that failed coup in August '91. Desperate attempt to turn back the clock, but it completely backfired, just accelerated the collapse.
Leading to the weak CIS, instability, disorder, even war in places like Moscow.
After the coup failed, the USSR formally dissolved. The Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, replaced it, but it was toothless. Period of chaos, economic shock, political instability, independence movements, even armed conflict in some areas as the new states emerged.
And the end result, 15 new states, global order totally changed.
Monumental shift. End of the Cold War, start of a whole new era.
Under Gorbachev, changes were happening even before Russia declared independence. Perestroika, glasnost.
Yeah, Gorbachev's leadership, even before the final collapse, started huge shifts. Perestroika restructuring the economy, allowing some private ownership, more autonomy for businesses, even for satellite states.
And glasnost openness, freedom of expression after decades of tight control.
Exactly. Glasnost opened things up, allowed criticism, discussion of forbidden topics, a huge change.
Looking back, some say those policies showed Gorbachev wasn't really intending to fight to keep the Soviet empire together.
That's one interpretation, yeah. His reforms, his reluctance to use force against independence movements. Some see it as a sign he wasn't committed to holding on to the empire at all costs.
And the result was demonstrations everywhere, nationalist leaders popping up.
Huge wave of protests across the USSR, including Russia. And nationalist leaders emerged in different republics, all with different goals, autonomy, independence.
Russia itself took steps, changed its name, declared Russian the state language in March '90. Yeltsin elected chairman.
Yeah, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic became the Russian Federation. Symbolic, but important. Russian declared the state language. And Boris Yeltsin, pushing for Russian sovereignty, got elected chairman of its Supreme Soviet. Big moves towards independence.
Gorbachev tried to salvage things with a new union treaty in '91.
He did, March '91, a last attempt to keep some kind of union together. But the Russian authorities under Yeltsin basically ignored it, undermined it. They were focused on Russia first.
And after that treaty failed, declarations of independence just snowballed. Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltics.
Yep, the floodgates opened. Once the treaty talks broke down, republic after republic declared sovereignty, then full independence. Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltics were major ones, leading the charge.
And the final blow, maybe, was the coup attempt against Gorbachev.
Yeah.
His house arrest in Crimea.
The August '91 coup, yeah. Hardliners trying to stop the disintegration, put Gorbachev under house arrest, but it failed miserably, just discredited the central government even more and sped up the final collapse.
So independence declared by late '91. But the USSR officially dissolved in early '92.
Right. Practically, it was over by end of '91, but the formal, legal dissolution, dismantling the remaining Soviet structures, that happened in the first half of 1992.
And by June '92, all the former republics had cut ties, renamed things, solidified their independence.
Yep. By end of June 92, everyone had formally seceded, dissolved Soviet ties, or renamed any remaining USSR-linked positions. The Soviet era was definitively over on paper, too.
And during all this chaos, ordinary people were just trying to figure things out, right? People were taking initiative.
Absolutely. With central authority collapsing, lots of individuals just had to adapt, make their own way, shape their lives without waiting for official permission. A period of immense uncertainty, but also grassroots adaptation.
Initially, there was some optimism around Yeltsin and the democratic movement in Moscow, despite the elite power struggles.
Yeah. In the immediate aftermath, even with all the infighting among the elites, there was a fair bit of public trust, hope invested in Yeltsin and the promise of democracy, a break from the Soviet past.
Gorbachev's economic reforms, like privatization, sped up towards the end.
They did. In the lead-up to the final dissolution, the pace of domestic reforms quickened. The Ministry of Finance pushed rapid privatization plans to try and shift to a market economy.
Plans in places like Ivanovo, St. Petersburg, to give property to workers and managers.
Yeah, concrete plans were being made to transfer ownership of state enterprises directly to employees and management, a key part of trying to decentralize the economy.
But there were disagreements about when to formally dissolve the USSR. Some wanted slower, some faster.
Definitely different opinions. Some leaders wanted a more gradual transition, worried about chaos. Others wanted a quick, clean break so the new states could focus on their own pressing social and political problems without the baggage of the dying union.
And the Russians acknowledged lots of tricky issues remained, like borders, and started drawing new internal borders for the Russian Federation.
Yeah, the leadership knew the collapse left huge, unresolved questions, borders between new states, status of autonomous regions. So the Russian Federation itself had to start the complex, often difficult process of defining its own new internal administrative boundaries for the post-Soviet reality.
Economic transition, price reform in '91, but also printing money, raising inflation fears.
Key part of the shift, yeah. Freeing prices from state control. But combined with monetary expansion, it immediately stoked fears of hyperinflation wiping out savings.
And privatization led to way more inequality. Gini coefficients went up.
Sharply. Privatization resulted in a massive widening of the income gap. A small elite got incredibly rich, while many struggled. Big impact on income distribution.
Potential for trickle-down growth? Maybe, but the economy was super unstable. Boom and bust. Government policy swings.
Theoretically, maybe growth could spread eventually. But in reality, the early post-Soviet economy was incredibly volatile. Boom-bust cycles, often driven by inconsistent government policies, shocks to state capacity, just very unstable.
Clearly needed a new, stable economic strategy.
Urgently needed. Something coherent, long-term, to foster sustainable growth and reduce that volatility.
Before '89, the Soviet command economy kept prices artificially low, right? Government propped things up.
Yeah, prices often below production cost.
Yeah.
The central government poured in subsidies to republics facing deflation just to keep the system afloat.
But analysis suggests Russia didn't actually have a total economic freefall, even during the '90-91 credit crunch.
Interesting point from the source, yeah. Despite the chaos, econometric analysis suggests it wasn't a complete, unmitigated freefall. More complex than just total collapse.
Though freeing prices while raising loan limits created problems. Bad loans, price hike default cycles.
That combination was damaging. Prices shot up, borrowers couldn't repay, leading to waves of bad loans. Created this cycle. Prices rise. Loans default. Banks in trouble. Prices rise again. Destabilizing for the financial system.
And how much local state banks pulled back funding varied, impacting regions differently. Deficits, job losses.
Yeah, the degree of state bank withdrawal really mattered locally. Regions where support vanished faster tended to see bigger budget problems, more workforce decline, less economic activity overall.
And sensitivity analysis confirms this wasn't just random.
Apparently so. The results hold up even when you account for things like tax elasticity and time lags. The link between state bank withdrawal and local economic pain seems robust.
Politically, Russia proclaiming sovereignty led to republics forming within the Russian Federation.
Yeah, that declaration of Russian sovereignty was a catalyst. It asserted Russia's self-rule, but also spurred the creation of numerous smaller, ethnic-based republics inside the Russian Federation itself.
That declaration was August 1990, declaring the RSFSR a sovereign state.
Formally adopted then, yeah. A clear statement of intent within the crumbling USSR.
And there was an earlier Declaration on the Thinking of State Sovereignty in July '90.
Right, sort of a preliminary document, signaled the direction things were moving, built momentum towards the formal declaration.
Then the Law on Economic Sovereignty, July 30th. First big step towards a market economy, independence from Moscow center, refusing new union bodies.
Groundbreaking law. Asserted Russia's economic independence from the Soviet central government and budget. Explicitly refused to join new union institutions. Really aimed at establishing a market economy basis.
So that law really started the transfer of power to the Russian Federation. Plans for a new constitution, Russian institutions, future cooperation with other republics.
Effectively, yes. Marked the start of shifting real governmental functions to Russia. Included plans for a new constitution, independent Russian institutions, and it envisioned future collaboration with other republics, but on Russia's terms, bilaterally.
New constitution adopted in '91, focused on changing how institutions worked, not just renaming them.
Crucial step, aimed to fundamentally alter how government operated, moving away from the Soviet model, not just putting new labels on old structures.
But the source says collectivized agriculture wasn't fully dismantled in the '90s. Limited desecuritization.
Yeah, that's significant. Despite huge political economic changes, the basic structure of land ownership, farming, heavily influenced by Soviet collective farms, didn't radically transform immediately.
And national identity, cultural unity within the Russian Federation was weak initially, not ethnoculturally unified.
The source makes that point. Early 90s sense of shared national belonging was limited. Despite ethnic Russians being dominant, the RF was diverse, not strongly unified culturally or ethnically.
No clear sense of national dignity hierarchy among groups. Local authorities managed things, favoring cities early on.
Yeah, lack of an established hierarchy among ethnic groups was a challenge. Local authorities often took the lead in managing unity and competition, and initially, urban centers had more clout than rural areas in that process.
Okay, modern Russia. Huge challenges after '91. Tough transition to market economy, massive corruption.
Immense challenges. Transition was chaotic, deeply complicated by pervasive corruption at all levels.
Soaring prices, wages unpaid, unemployment surging, GDP drop worse than the Great Depression.
Yeah, hyperinflation, wage arrears, mass unemployment as state firms collapse. The GDP fall between 92 and 95 was indeed statistically worse than the U.S. Great Depression, a profound economic shock.
Mid-90s, government and business deeply tangled, often corruptly. Privatization creates powerful oligarchs looting assets, sending money abroad.
Exactly. Lines blurred completely. Privatization, meant to create a market, instead fueled the rise of these super wealthy, politically connected oligarchs, often acquired assets cheaply, siphoned wealth out of the country.
Fueling inflation, damaging society.
Rampant corruption, capital flight, just made inflation worse, caused widespread hardship, inequality, deep disillusionment for most people.
Then the big handover. Yeltsin picks Putin as successor. Putin takes over December 31st, 1999.
Pivotal moment. Yeltsin designates his PM, Putin, as successor. Orchestrated transition, Putin becomes president on the last day of 1999, start of the Putin era.
And Putin's 2 decades since. Consolidating power, more assertive foreign policy.
That's been the pattern. Consistent consolidation of political power in the Kremlin, and a foreign policy aimed at reasserting Russian influence, challenging perceived Western dominance.
Initially, he had to deal with those Yeltsin-era oligarchs, remnants of Soviet power. He seems forceful.
Yeah, early on, he faced challenges from powerful oligarchs and old guard elements. He navigated those struggles skillfully, often forcefully, gradually marginalizing threats to his authority, reasserting state control.
And he dismantled Yeltsin's arrangements. Changed how governors were elected, took over TV stations, controlled Duma parties.
Systematically rolled back some of the more decentralized aspects of the Yeltsin era. Centralized power by changing governor elections, brought key media, especially TV, under closer state influence, consolidated control over dominant Duma parties, limiting real opposition.
His rise was helped by the instability of the '90s.
Arguably, yes. The chaos, hardship, disillusionment of the Yeltsin years created a public desire for order, stability, strong leadership. Putin offered that.
And being PM under Yeltsin gave him a base.
Crucial experience at the top, built networks within the state apparatus, provided a springboard.
His government didn't prosecute the oligarchs for past deeds, but restricted their political media power, replaced them with loyalists.
Kind of a pragmatic deal. Keep your wealth, stay out of politics and media criticism. Those who didn't play ball were marginalized, lost assets, replaced by oligarchs seen as more aligned with Kremlin interests.
Putin's idea of sovereignty seems to reject foreign criticism, setting the stage for stability helped by oil wealth.
He's consistently stressed national sovereignty, Russia's right to run its own affairs without outside interference. That stance, combined with rising energy prices providing huge revenues, contributed to a period of relative stability and economic improvement, at least for a time.
There have been protests, like after the 2011 elections, but nothing that really shook his power.
Intermittent protests, yes, but generally limited in scale and duration, haven't coalesced into a sustained challenge to his authority.
Key opponents vilified, jailed, protests repressed, Western criticism used as a foil.
That's been the pattern. Opponents often targeted by state media face legal action. Protests met with increasing repression. And Western criticism is often spun domestically as anti-Russian bias, used to rally support around the flag.
So Putin's rise is the result of everything that happened after the Soviet collapse, the chaotic Yeltsin years.
It's the culmination of that whole turbulent period, absolutely.
The brief, messy experiment with democracy and markets led to oligarchic capitalism, hardship for many.
Yeah, the 90s transition resulted in that concentration of wealth and power, while much of the population struggled.
And Western hopes for Russia just joining the liberal democratic club didn't pan out.
Those post-Cold War hopes proved unrealistic. Russia chose a different path, based on its own history, interests, elite priorities.
Did the West underestimate the new Russian elite's ability to form a kind of counterbloc, resisting Western dominance?
Possibly. Western analysts might not have fully grasped the elite's capacity and desire to carve out a distinct path, push back against perceived Western hegemony.
And maybe Western liberalism became less realistic, focusing on modernization, cooperation.
You could argue that post-Cold War optimism led to less focus on traditional power politics, more on hoping Russia would just naturally become like the West through cooperation. Maybe underestimating enduring rivalries.
And Western attempts to put Russia back in its place, especially after Putin returned, maybe made things worse.
Some Western policies aimed at constraining Russia might have been seen as hostile by Moscow, potentially exacerbating tensions, contributing to the current confrontational climate.
Yeltsin's surprise TV resignation, appointing the relatively unknown Putin, a huge turning point.
December 31st, 1999. Yeah, unexpected, pivotal moment in post-Soviet history.
Putin seemed a natural choice then, not part of the unpopular Yeltsin family, seen as trustworthy, willing.
In that uncertain climate, yeah. He wasn't tied to Yeltsin's inner circle. Projected competence, reliability, readiness to take charge during a tough time seemed like a logical pick to Yeltsin's team.
And Yeltsin's circle probably realized more instability, political violence was just too risky.
Likely a shared understanding. Continued chaos, potential for violence that was a threat to everyone's interests, stability was needed.
The security services, intelligence agencies, generally anti-American but also wanted internal stability, agreement among themselves.
While often holding anti-U.S. views, these powerful agencies also had a strong interest in domestic order, internal consensus. Stability ensured their own continued influence.
And basically, state resources were depleted, no effective new social contract between state and people had formed.
By the end of Yeltsin's term, yeah, state legitimacy, resources were strained, a sustainable, mutually agreeable relationship between the government and citizens hadn't really been established, left a vacuum, a desire for stronger leadership.
21st century. Russia uses energy wealth, modernized military, pursues dominance, peaking after Putin's 2012 return.
Leveraging energy revenues, investing in the military, Russia definitely became more assertive, pursuing national dominance regionally and globally. That trend intensified after Putin returned to the presidency in 2012.
Leading the West to see Russia increasingly as a threat.
Yeah, that growing assertiveness, challenging perceived Western dominance, led many in the West to view Russia with increasing alarm as a significant geopolitical challenger.
Then Ukraine 2022. Escalation leads to Russia being widely declared a pariah state by the West.
Unprecedented situation, widespread condemnation, severe sanctions, diplomatic isolation from many Western nations, a profound rupture.
Ushering in a new Cold War-like vibe. Formal North-South, East-West divisions.
Increasingly looks like that. Hardening divisions, a return to bloc mentality in foreign policy alignments.
Marked by diplomat expulsions, justifying covert ops, info war, new alliances with Asia, Africa, Latin America.
All signs of heightened tension, tit-for-tat expulsions, open talk of covert actions, information warfare, and a clear Russian pivot towards building alliances outside the West, deepening ties in Asia, Africa, Latin America.
So the 2020s are a new era. beyond the old bipolar and unipolar orders.
Definitely a new, more complex phase. Multipolar world, more actors, less predictable.
Did Western dominance after the Cold War kind of push powers like China and Russia towards being adversarial, limited their options?
It's an argument that the unipolar moment made major regional powers feel constrained, compelling them to adopt more adversarial stances to protect their interests and challenge that dominance.
And while big hot wars seemed unlikely, proxy wars continued.
Direct major power conflict was seen as too risky, but proxy conflicts, regional struggles fueled by competing interests, persisted.
Conflicts in Africa, Balkans, Middle East, reflecting U.S.-Europe versus Russia power struggles.
Often, yeah. Those regions became arenas for geopolitical competition, with major powers backing different sides, pursuing rival agendas.
Russia's alliance with China is a major challenge to U.S. hegemony.
The deepening Russia-China strategic partnership, presents a significant counterweight to long-standing U.S. global influence, signals a potential shift in the balance of power.
So 30 years of trying various pro-Western policies ended with near-total isolation in 2022 due to Ukraine.
You could frame it that way. Russia's post-Soviet attempts at integration with the West ultimately culminated in this dramatic break following the 2022 Ukraine operation, collapsing the old foundation of its diplomacy with the West.
Forcing Russia onto a new, uncertain path. Vertical structures, diverse alliances, engaging neutral states, old principles gone.
Seems so. The rupture forces a strategic rethink. Less reliance on the West, more focus on internal consolidation, building hierarchical structures, diversifying partnerships globally, engaging with non-aligned nations. Traditional foreign policy assumptions are out the window.
The source ends with this really reflective bit about Russia's own self-perception. Complex, contradictory.
Yeah, it starts by noting Russia's history of seeing itself in complex ways, sometimes unique and separate, sometimes wanting to be part of the wider world.
Highlighting Russia's massive cultural contributions. Literature, art, philosophy, intentionally cultivated over centuries.
Absolutely. Underscores the incredible richness, the deliberate nurturing of Russian culture across so many fields, its immense heritage.
And it suggests Russia might not even fully grasp its own cultural wealth.
Makes that point, yeah. That maybe Russia itself doesn't always recognize the full depth and global impact of its own cultural output. Kind of fascinating.
And uses metaphors. Russia slumbering, but unique artistic development, maybe unburdened by certain histories.
Evocative language, yeah. Russia in a kind of slumber, holding unique potential, suggests its artistic path was different, perhaps shaped by avoiding some specific historical oppressions seen elsewhere.
Also mentions the paradox. Russia taunting the world, but also absorbing its riches and knowledge.
Dives into that contradiction, projecting defiance, challenge, while also being remarkably good at absorbing, adapting ideas and culture from elsewhere.
So the ending is quite poetic, mystical, reflecting on Russia's potential, its unknowable future.
Adopts that tone, yeah. Contemplating this vast, unrealized potential, acknowledging the uncertainty of where Russia goes next on the world stage.
Looking at literature specifically, church literature booming after Christianization, influenced by Byzantine Germany.
Right. Christianization brings this flourishing of church writing, heavily shaped by monks, theologians arriving from the Byzantine Empire and parts of Germany. They brought those early traditions.
And the 12th century Slavic Bible translation was key. Church Slavonic becomes the language.
Pivotal moment. Made religious texts accessible, established Church Slavonic as the language for liturgy theology for centuries.
Mentions the Muscovite Orthodox Church splitting from Constantinople in the mid-16th century too. Big deal.
Huge event. Create a more independent, nationally focused Russian Orthodoxy. Profound impact on religion, politics, culture.
And this new Slavic alphabet, invented in the Nagli period, used by South Slavs, even in Hungary.
Yeah, developed by a scholar with Moscoviana ties, gained wide use among South Slavs, even Hungary, until the 17th century. Shows Russia's broader cultural reach in the Slavic world.
Translating Horace's Art of Poetry was unique for East Slavs then. Early classical influence.
Noteworthy, yeah. Shows an early engagement with classical Western literary theory. Indicates intellectual curiosity beyond just religious texts.
But creativity back then often meant reworking older texts, not totally original stuff.
That was the main trend, yeah. Adapting, revising, elaborating on existing works, respect for tradition, focus on interpreting existing knowledge.
But a new kind of literature emerged in the 17th century, reinterpreting history through the Old Testament, More imaginative.
Just started then, yeah. New style connecting Russian history to Old Testament narratives. More imaginative, almost mythological, demiurgical elements in the storytelling.
Medj's earlier descriptions, like Jericho and Tibet, but this new poetry was more rhetorical, less strictly biblical at the end.
Right. While drawing on religious themes, the source says the finales were often more rhetorical flourishes, less tied directly to biblical accounts compared to earlier examples.
And later manuscripts show more Greek influence, more invention and imagination.
Concludes by noting that, yeah, discoveries show growing Greek intellectual impact, and just more literary invention, originality, imagination creeping into the writing.
Okay, switching to art and music. First half of 19th century, no strong national school yet for opera, orchestral, chamber music.
Source suggests not fully developed yet, yeah. Musical activity existed, but a distinct, recognized Russian national school in those major genres hadn't quite emerged.
And the few music societies weren't really enough. Even with secular songs influencing choral music?
Limited societies, often inadequate for the growing interest. Secular folk influences were there, but a more robust musical infrastructure was missing.
But the second half of the 19th century, huge change. Russia becomes a leading European music center, attracting talent, nurturing its own.
Dramatic transformation. Russia rapidly rises to prominence, attracts big names from Europe, but crucially fosters its own vibrant, distinct national school of composers and musicians. Think Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov.
And new music societies grew, promoting education, performance.
Lots of them, often affiliated with bigger organizations, played a huge role in music education, concerts, building appreciation.
And after the 1850s, these societies started popping up in smaller towns, driven by ordinary people, not just nobles.
That's a key point. Grassroots effort shows music becoming more embedded in society, not just an elite pastime.
More educated musicians, plus theater growth, leads to plans for a big concert hall, later named after Kirov.
Yeah, growing expertise and interest-fueled ambition. Plans for a major St. Petersburg concert hall, eventually named after the Soviet figure Kirov.
Mentions Maxim Gorky's People's House idea and Cherepnin's radical plans for public concerts. Early attempts linked to the Philharmonic.
Yeah, Gorky's vision for accessible culture. Cherepnin's progressive ideas for public concert life. Early efforts to organize music for broader audiences connected to the developing Philharmonic Society.
But Cherepnin was forced out. Shows the political limits.
Sadly, yes. His forward-thinking, maybe challenging ideas led to his forced emigration. Shows the risks artists faced if they pushed boundaries too hard.
Still, some public music societies succeeded quickly, welcomed by everyone. Shows real public hunger.
Despite challenges, yeah. Many societies took off, embraced by people from all social levels. Clear evidence of genuine public interest in music.
And they tried hard to offer diverse programs. Avoid repetition, broaden horizons.
Leaders consciously curated varied programs, wanted to avoid boring audiences with the same old stuff, introduce them to a wider range of music, really enrich the experience.
And finally, songs and choral music were important, leading to choral societies, orchestra rentals.
Very important in programs, reflecting Russia's strong vocal tradition. That spurred demand for dedicated choirs and the need to rent orchestras for accompaniment. Helped build a more complex musical ecosystem. So, circling back to your first question, how did those tribes become modern Russia? It's this incredibly complex weave, isn't it? Geography causing early divisions, Kievan Rus' uniting things, then the Mongol invasion paradoxically clearing the path for Moscow's clever rise. Then the chaos of the time of troubles, the long Romanov reign growing distant, Peter the Great forcing westernization, Catherine expanding, Napoleonic Wars sparking dissent, industrialization fueling revolution.
Right, 1917, the Soviet experiment.
February and October revolutions, the immense upheaval, the ideals, and the brutal reality under Stalin, the Cold War, the collapse, and now modern Russia still finding its place.
It really is an epic sweep. So much contradiction, resilience, ambition. Moscow's rise still fascinates me. And Peter the Great's sheer force. The consequences were huge. And the Soviet era, its complexities, its tragedies, it shapes so much.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder why democracy took such a different path in Russia compared to elsewhere.
Thinking about this whole long, tangled history, all the cycles of change, consolidation, what's the single thread, do you think, that runs through it most consistently? Is it that tension between East and West? Or maybe the constant return to centralized power in response to pressure?
That's a great question. Definitely something for you, our listener, to mull over. This has just been a glimpse, of course. We really encourage you to check out the source material, look for other perspectives on this endlessly complex and fascinating country.
Absolutely. Thanks for diving in with us.